Hello everyone, welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, Curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And those of you who saw our Instagram post yesterday know that this week we are celebrating Studio Loja Saarinen, Cranbrook's famed weaving workshop. Next Tuesday, a week from today, at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I will be giving a virtual lecture about the studio. And I hope that all of you go to the link in my profile at the center here. It will take you to the registration page to sign up for our first Uncovering Cranbrook virtual lecture. Today, I thought that I would come to you live from the outside of Studio Loja Saarinen. Next Tuesday, the lecture is going to be from Saarinen House, and it will be a slide lecture with historic photographs and images. And so I thought today it might be interesting to actually show you where all of the rugs were being made. So I'm here at the intersection of Lone Pine Road and Academy Way, and Studio Loja Saarinen was actually right at the entrance to the Cranbrook Academy of Art campus. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth next week on our history of the studio, about how Cranbrook Academy of Art came to be. But this quadrangle of buildings, construction started in 1927. In October of 1928, Studio Loja Saarinen opened. You would enter in through this door, now the studio of Elliot Earls. And then this was the main weaving room. Now, the rest of the craft studios opened in 1929, in January of that year, so a little bit later. In this quadrangle, it's where Cranbrook Academy of Art began, but those of you who have been watching my tours long enough know that the opening of Cranbrook Academy of Art was not a smooth occurrence. It didn't happen just one day that George Booth and Eliel Saarinen set out and said, we're opening a new art academy here in Bloomfield Hills. Instead, it was a sort of series of events, the first of which was the Cranbrook Foundation setting up the craft studios. And in this courtyard here, in 1929, you would have found 6 craft workshops. On this side was the iron shop, which is where the peacock gates were made, and many of the iron gates around Cranbrook's campus. Then there was the bookbindery, led by the Swiss bookbinder John Eschmann. In the corner was the Cranbrook Press, which was printing all of the literature for the schools, for the church, as well as the Cranbrook Foundation, so the printing shop. Then there was the silver shop, led by Arthur Neville Kirk. And then the last room was the weaving room. And this is what I thought we'd focus on for today's Live at 5. So of these 6 activities, bookbinding, cabinet making, iron shop, silver shop, printing shop, the weaving studio was the only craft studio that was led by a woman. It was led by Mrs. Loja Saarinen, who had her training in Finland in sculpture, and she also studied in Paris. She was an avid gardener, and she did batiks and embroidery, dressmaking. But weaving she came to later in life. When she opened her studios in 1928, it was the first time she had overseen any commercial workshop, and it was the first time she was ever involved in textiles as a profession. We'll talk next Tuesday, the whole story of the weaving workshop, but today I thought we would just look at the building that it's in, which was designed, of course, by her husband, the late, great Eliel Saarinen, who was, of course, the architect of many of Cranbrook's institutions. And this quadrangle here, which would open in parts between 1929 and 1931, was his first building completed to his own design without the assistance of George Booth, Henry Booth, or J. Robert F. Swanson. The residence hall here is a little later, 1931, and then the architecture studio was the last portion. But in these first buildings in the quadrangle, we see Saarinen's dedication to the arts and crafts movement and this sort of Finnish interpretation of the English cottage style built in the American Midwest. So the roofs are slate, and interestingly, there are only two slate roofs at Cranbrook. There are a number of roofs that look like slate roofs. Many are ceramic tiles. Only the arts and crafts studios in the building directly opposite, the administration building, have true slate roofs. And if we look at the one that covers the weaving showroom, do you see how the bottom slates are larger than the top slates? So that is a fact of slate roof construction. Your top tiles have to be smaller because the weight of the roof tiles could actually crack the lower tiles if it was all the same size going up. So you have to shrink the tiles as they get towards the top. It also extends the roof line in this sort of trick of the eye that Walt Disney and his Imagineers would take advantage of. It makes the roof look much larger by having the tiles get smaller. But it's a product of building a true slate roof. Then there are the fabulous bricks, which are load-bearing. So this is not a steel frame building. These are load-bearing brick walls with timber frame ceiling trusses, and then the slate roofs atop the timber trusses. And I love these bricks in particular. These are the most pronounced. Saarinen would use a similar brick type really across the entire academy, but here it is the most extreme, where you are seeing these color changes on the brick. And what this is this is in the brick kiln. Here is another brick resting on the brick. Here's another one. Sometimes it's extremely pronounced, and you can see exactly where they were sitting. So some of the bricks were fired almost like a hash mark stack, and then some of the bricks are fired end to end. And so what you're seeing is not a change in the clay, it's a change in the amount of heat that got to that brick. And so as the bricks were fired, the heat would cause these chemical reactions to occur at different rates, and you would get different color on the brick itself. Saarinen also used Roman bricks within the quadrangle, and so here you see much crisper bricks that were sliced with a different way, using a different type of clay, fired much more evenly. And we call these Roman bricks because Roman bricks were much more flat and narrow. And you'll see even things like the mortar line is kept much tighter than it is on the main building. Of course, all of Cranbrook's doors and windows are different. And then up above, you see the exposed concrete roof plane with the little cast concrete column capital here as well. Now, I'm talking about the whole quadrangle, and I promised you I'd talk about Studio Loja Saarinen, so we'll venture back to the studio. She was the most successful of the craft studios. Really, she was the only one who was successful. She was the only one to ever turn a profit, and the only one to survive the Great Depression, and the only one to keep operating after the Academy of Art was opened. And so she was in this corner of the quadrangle from 1928 until 1942. She had her weaving showroom in the building going this way, centered on a fireplace at one end. And then she had looms in this room and looms in the level below that opens out onto Lone Pine Road. And eventually she had looms across the street as well. My favorite detail about this side of her studio is the chimney, which climbs up to this sort of leaping dog that goes across these two limestone pillars. And you can see the limestone pillars have this sort of wave design and then this abstract column capital. It almost is sort of precursor to the fluted or telescoping columns of Kingswood School for Girls, which is a year later. There's also this wonderful corner where you see the use of the standard size brick and then the Roman brick and tiles. So some of those are actually roofing tiles that are used instead of brick, and then the Roman brick forming the border. And then you have the cast concrete molding beneath the slate roof, and then the copper drain gutters. Now, the studio, the entire quadrangle is an irregular shape. So this is not a 90-degree turn, it's about an 85-degree turn. And so as we look at the building, you'll see that this side is actually at an acute angle to Academy Way. And so the rooms inside are all trapezoids instead of being rectangles. And you also have this moment where Loja Saarinen connects in 1931. This roof is 2 years later than the rest of the quadrangle, but it sort of covers up the fact that this wall is really jogging at different directions. And then there are the great windows where Mrs. Saarinen's Swedish weavers could sit at their looms and look out at the world, see who was coming to visit, see what was happening up and down Academy Way. Mostly they would have looked out and seen construction of the rest of the Cranbrook campus. And on these windows, this is, to me, a great example of how Saarinen takes inspiration from a source and then turns it into something totally unique. So he takes this sort of Tudoresque bay window that is what his client would have wanted. George Booth was dedicated to the English arts and crafts, and he turns it into something a little bit Finnish, but also just a little bit new and different. It's this idea that to be modern, one doesn't necessarily have to get rid of ornament or get rid of pitched roofs or get rid of classical building, traditional building construction, but that there are a multitude of ways of being modern. And one of them is to slowly evolve style as opposed to launch a revolution, which 1928, when he's designing this, is a moment of extraordinary architectural revolution in places like Germany and Austria. But here, Saarinen, it very much is an architecture of evolution, not revolution. And so there's nothing here that's quite pulled from architectural history, but it still feels familiar. I love the way that he takes what is essentially a square pilaster and he carves these little shallow bays in. And so you have these sort of semicircle divots fluting, and then he brings in these pillars that are run not an arbitrary height up. You see the sort of logic that this is running up to the halfway point of the window, and then the window is roughly the same dimension as below. It's all proportional, but it creates this very dynamic corner where you have this sort of rhythm of the different piers forming each corner of the window, and all of them are capped with these little floral motifs. So here we have a sort of tulip. On the other side, we have a Greek acanthus, so pulling straight from architectural history, a bellflower. And then there is the water fountain that is built into the ashlar block limestone. There's also this little block that pops out here. I think perhaps Saarinen was envisioning that would eventually be carved. There were a number of craft studios that never opened, and one of those was a sculptor or a stone carver, and then one was Professor Marotti, who was the Finnish or the Hungarian sculptor who carved at the boys' school and who left Cranbrook before the craft studios got underway because he found Bloomfield Hills to be provincial, and so he went back to Europe. But I wonder if Marotti had stayed on, if that little block would be carved into something, or if it was always meant to just be an abstract block. I go back and forth every week as to whether they're intentional or unfinished. On this side of the fireplace, we see there is a lovely chicken, or a bird with his tail feather on top of the fireplace. And on the edge of Studio Loja Saarinen, Loya had this office area which sticks out towards Lone Pine Road. And one of my favorite brick details that I think I've pointed out on it Live at 5 before is this little lancet window, which you can almost imagine Loya sitting with her bow and arrow and her quiver, protecting the academy at all cost. And then once Bloomfield Hills became civilized, we blocked up the medieval little slot. Just my fantasy of the building of Cranbrook. But I love the way that now Saarinen uses the Roman brick, and he gets 4 courses of the Roman brick within the dimension of 2 courses of the standard brick. And then other bricks are simply pulled or pushed into the building so that on a sunny day like today, it causes a shadow. And then on a snowy day, the snow will land on this brick and it will cause a little white line. And these are sort of regularly distributed all around the building so that you get these little snow and shadow marks as you look at the building across the seasons. Now, I'm going to step out and we'll look at the other side of Studio Loja Saarinen. You have this wonderful repetition of the semicircular wall. So you have the semicircle here and then the semicircle there. And those of you who know Cranbrook well know that this semicircle will reappear at the library door. It reappears on the main teapot, tea service that Saarinen designs. And here we have the main window of Studio Loja Saarinen, which would originally have had hand-woven drapes. And beneath this window sat custom furniture designed by Eliel for Studio Loja Saarinen, and then hand-woven rugs. Next week at our lecture, you will be treated to all sorts of historic images, as well as some contemporary images. I did ask Elliot Earls if I could take you inside today, but when he and his family when Cranbrook shut down in March, they headed up north and they're still there, and the studio is not ready to be shown. So I've mentioned this before, but Cranbrook is not a museum. The only historic interior that we maintain his campus we still use, and so Studio Loja Saarinen is still an active artist studio. Now, I love the top rate art, this great gable end, where you see the different bricks, and that's not really a color difference, that's just different brick types that you're seeing reflected in the camera lens. And Saarinen is, I think, looking towards medieval Finnish decorative gable ends, and so that's something that if you just search Finnish medieval church, you're going to see a very similar use of brick, stone, and in Finland also render, or plaster. And then on this side you see how the weavers of Studio Loja Saarinen would not have been working in the dark in the basement, so the entire studio, the courtyard is raised a level above the street on the inside. And then these little pop-outs are the stairways. Interestingly, only one of the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts studios had a street door. And so this was the original entrance into the Cranbrook Press, or the Cranbrook Printing Shop, which I think reflects its more public role, that it was the official printer for all of Cranbrook, and so it had a public entrance. And then, of course, just to place you where we are, here are the main gates into the art museum, where you see again the semicircle picked up and then looking up the Triton pools towards Cranbrook Art Museum through Saarinen's nickel gates towards Saarinen's museum. And then here we see the outside of the Arts and Crafts studios with the double stair entrance. So if you want to learn more about the architecture of Cranbrook Academy of Art, make sure you check out the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Facebook page. This building and the rest of the buildings on the street maybe a couple of months ago. If you want to learn more about you do want to learn more about Studio Loja Saarinen, then do head to the center.cranbrook.edu website, where you can sign up for my first Uncovering Cranbrook lecture. It's taking place next Tuesday, July 28th at both 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And it's $20. Come on along. It'll be 50 minutes followed by a 10-minute Q&A. Lots of great historic photographs as well as contemporary color photographs of the weavings. And you'll see the inside of these buildings, and you'll learn more about how Cranbrook operated this really remarkable hand weaving studio from 1928 to 1942, employing countless Swedish immigrant hand weavers under the direction of Mrs. Loja Saarinen. Thanks so much for watching. I will be back here on Instagram Live next Tuesday at 5 p.m. And I'll be on Facebook Live tomorrow at 5 p.m. on the Center for Collections and Research Facebook page. Thanks for watching. Send me a message if you have any requests about where to go next, and I will see you next Tuesday.